Hi again, everybody, and welcome back to Women for All Seasons, part number 3 in a series of 6 profiles about 6 remarkable women who at one point or another called Chicago their hometown. Tonight's part 3 is about the extraordinary Frances Glessner Lee. All of these images are used within the fair use parameters of the American copyright law. My name is Clarence Goodman, and here we go. Frances Glessner Lee, the case in a nutshell. Now, life started out pretty good for young Frances Glessner. This is not her hair. This is her father, John J. Glessner, who was rich. He looks like a rich guy. He had a whole bunch of money. In fact, so much money that their stately mansion in the Prairie Avenue Mansion District in the southern portion of the downtown area of Chicago is not only still there, it is a museum. Moreover, the Glessner family was instrumental in the founding of International Harvester. Perhaps you've heard of them. So young Franny had it pretty good coming out of the gate, being the favorite of 2 children of an extraordinarily rich family. And she was a remarkable young woman for a person growing up in the latter part of the 19th century. She indeed was inquisitive. She indeed was intelligent. She indeed was driven to do everything that she could do properly and correctly. And she started to hit some roadblocks fairly early on. This boundless energy and passion that she had was tempered by pretty poor health. And I guess you can say that the one silver lining that comes along with poor health is that you develop some self-reliance, you develop some self-awareness, and you develop a whole lot of hobbies, and you read a lot. One of her favorite things to read was the murder mysteries of Sherlock Holmes, which were all the rage in the Western world back then, and she was intrigued by how the title character was able to solve all of these mysteries using cunning and using science. And then another one of her interests was in the fascination with and the creation of miniatures. This is an image of a miniature set that she made for her beloved mother, whose name was also Frances. This is a replication or a depiction of the entire Chicago Symphony Orchestra in miniature form that she presented to her mother as, I believe it was, a birthday present. So these 2 passions of hers, the miniatures and the murder mystery stuff, she probably didn't know it at the time, but she was getting into some serious foreshadowing with regard to later on in life. Now, this might be one of the last pictures from her youth that she had where she was smiling, Frances Glessner. At this point, she was Frances Glessner Lee, having gotten married and had 3 children fairly quickly. And unlike most women back in the day, the early part of the 20th century, the latter part of the 19th century, she was not content with this life. She had a pretty unhappy marriage. And it's very interesting to note that when you look up anything biographical about her, it barely mentions her children, and it stops mentioning her one and only husband shortly after they divorced. Moreover, she would go back and destroy all of the pictures of herself that were with her husband, and many pictures of herself with her children, which is actually kind of sad, but it's quite a tell. So this is where one of her more interesting relationships gets going. She hits this glass ceiling now at the end of her marriage, and she decides to go in the other direction and pursue things of a vocational nature. And this is where one of her interesting relationships comes into play. This gentleman here is George Burgess McGrath. And he was actually one of the closest friends of Frances Glessner Lee's older brother. They went to school together, and this is a picture of Mr. McGrath fairly late in life. Now, Frances met Mr. McGrath when he was a young man and he was still in school. In fact, he was a student at Harvard Law School. This gentleman had a couple of interesting passions. One of his passions was the differentiation between the profession of a medical examiner and the profession of a coroner. Mr. McGrath was consumed with this idea that medical examiners should take the place of coroners. It had been the long-standing practice for coroners in most municipalities and most counties and so forth and states in this country of ours to be the ones who really took the bull by the horns and took charge of investigation into sudden and unexpected deaths. Now, this would be fine. However, this was an elected position, and these people weren't required to be doctors. Medical examiners, on the other hand, licensed physicians in the state or wherever he or she practices forensic pathology and had been hired by the jurisdiction to investigate sudden and unexpected deaths. A much more clinical, a much more detached, a much more methodic approach to answering the questions of the who, what, why, where, when, and how of somebody's dying. Although I guess the who would have been answered straight up as soon as they looked at the dead person's face. The other thing that McGrath was passionate about was the beauty of internal organs. And this is something that he passed on to Frances Glessner Lee. She absolutely shared this love and this appreciation for the beauty of internal organs, in addition to this passion as far as having coroners replaced by medical examiners. So one of the problems, though, with Mr. McGrath is that though he was a really, really smart guy, and Frances Glessner Lee thought the world of him, he seemed to be a wayward fellow and kind of broke all of the time. And he had been working on the faculty for the Harvard Medical School, and there always seemed to be some issue about would he be retained and tenure and things of this nature. Now, not only did Frances Glessner Lee have a tie with the Harvard School because part of her time as a youth was spent in New England, and her brother was an alum there and so forth. But she also had a big, big, big checkbook. So on the down low, she went to the Harvard Medical School and said, listen, fellers, I will underwrite you all of the time, but you got to take care of my guy McGrath, and you got to give him everything he wants, and eventually you need to move into the whole field and the whole prospect of having medical examination being championed by you as opposed to the traditional coroner. And so she becomes the patron of the Harvard Medical School, and this is where we get going. Now you look at this picture of her examining a skull there, and you wonder, well, my goodness, what is it about the dead that has so gotten to this woman? Well, maybe because she saw her own mortality fairly early on, being plagued by ill health from a fairly early age. That'll give you a real sense of your own mortality. But there are a couple of other ideas that might be in place. One, when she was a kid in Chicago, the Iroquois Theater fire occurred, which resulted in more than 600 people dying in a matter of moments. About a third of those people were children. This was in 1903. And then, so she was in town for that. And then a couple of decades later, she happened to be living in the Boston area when the Coconut Grove nightclub had a fire where hundreds of people died. And to this day, my friends, the Iroquois Theater fire and the Coconut Grove nightclub fire are the two biggest single conflagrations that resulted in the greatest number of fatalities. And I always have trouble with the word conflagration. There you are. I always have, and I'm not going to restart this thing because I botch it every time. If you know me well, you know that I have trouble pronouncing some words. Roosevelt. And so in her pursuit of all of these things and getting locked up, if you will, with George Burgess McGrath and looking into these things and becoming even more passionate about this vocation, this career of being a champion for the dead and a voice for the dead, she is named a state police captain by the great state of New Hampshire, the first woman in the history of the United States to hold that title. And so, Captain Lee, as she preferred to be addressed for the rest of her life, really has some cachet and a title to go along with her extraordinarily impressive checkbook. She gets this idea where she can tie one of her other great passions and her great loves into this field that she has chosen for herself. That is miniatures, and that is the study of how someone died and why. She decided to come up with all of these dioramas that depicted a death. No clues or anything were written down. And so the idea was for a person, an aspiring detective, to look at this miniature, examine it, and then theorize and come up with ideas as far as what happened. And see, this, just in the nature of this miniaturized version of a crime scene, you avoid one of the biggest complications and the biggest problems often happened with coroners, and that crime scenes would oftentimes, to this day, get compromised. And so not only was this a wonderful idea that she took it upon herself to realize, but she created these symposiums and these seminars where all of these people, by invitation only from her, would be treated to a bunch of time at a downtown hotel in Boston, and they would talk shop, and they would look at her miniaturized crime scenes, and they would do all of these things. And so many people who followed in her wake and followed her after she left this earth credited this unique approach to dead and the dying and crime scenes as one of the instrumental things that not only turned around the whole profession of investigating death, but really sealed the deal when it came to medical examiners versus coroners, as you can see here. And to this day, at I believe it is the crime lab in Baltimore, Maryland, you can go and see 41 of these miniature crime scenes that she so painstakingly put together, just like she did for the replica of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra that she did for her mother. And so over the course, the latter part of her life, she becomes a really important person, does Captain Lee. Her nutshell studies, as she called them, the explaining or illuminating the unexplained death. And to this end, Captain Lee is known as the mother of forensics and the patron saint of homicide detectives. And look at that. She's smiling in that picture, kind of. She must know that I'm talking about her, and I'm giving her props. I hope you've enjoyed this little afternoon together, gang. Part 4, which will be coming at you real soon, is about Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Until our paths cross again, take very good care of yourselves. May your God go with you. And please think of these women for all seasons. So long, everybody.